The second type of bond that we can make is an ionic bond. So when you think about this type of bond, think about two elements that have opposite charges. So think about elements on the right side of the periodic table and elements on the left side of the periodic table. So they both interact. It is the second strongest of the three types of bonds that we have. And the last type of bond that we have is a hydrogen bond. So here we have two water molecules. So a water molecule is composed of two hydrogens and one oxygen. Oxygen is one of the most electronegative elements in the periodic table, so it's hungry for electrons. And so what happens is that the electron that is in the hydrogen, it spends the majority of the time near the oxygen. Now, because the electron has a minus charge, this gives the oxygen molecule a minus charge. Now, the reason why it's minus charge, it's a partial minus charge, is because the hydrogen still wants its electrons. Now, at the same time, the hydrogen has a partial positive charge. And so what happens with the hydrogen bond is you have the interaction, in this particular case, with two water molecules. It is the weakest of the three types of bonds. It is the weakest because it's only a partial attraction. But let's talk a little bit more about carbon. Carbon, it is the fourth most common element in the universe and the second most common element in your body. Look at this. Just 6 elements make the bulk of you. Oxygen makes 65% of you, carbon 18% of you, hydrogen 9% of you, nitrogen 3% of you, and phosphorus and sulfur 2% of you. Now if you combine oxygens and hydrogens, it makes 75% of you. That makes water. So 75% of you is actually water. So let's talk more about carbon. So when we're talking about organic molecules, it basically means that you have a bunch of carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon bonds and at least one carbon to hydrogen bond. An inorganic molecule does not have the carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon bond, and they also don't have the carbon to hydrogen bond. Alright, so let's talk more about the biomolecules of life. So there's 4 of them. So you have lipids or fats, you have nucleic acids, whether it's DNA or RNA, you have proteins, and then you have carbohydrates. And in my case, I'm also including water. The reason for that is because, as we already been talking in this chapter, 75% of you is water. And the reactions that happens in your body actually happens under the presence of water. So let's learn more about these biomolecules of life. So one important concept when it comes to biology, to the molecules of life, is that shape matters. If a protein doesn't have the proper shape, it cannot do its function. So whenever we're talking about the biomolecules of life, we should also think about it, like if there's too much of them, is that a good thing? Is there too little? Is that a good thing? Or you just need the right amount. And later we'll see that having too much of them is not a good thing, and having too little of them is not a good thing. You just need to have just the right amount, just the right balance, just like everything in life. In life, everything has to be balanced. So the 4 biomolecules of life are carbohydrates, lipids or fats, proteins, nucleic acid, whether it's DNA or RNA. So these are the 4 very important biomolecules of life. You need them. Your body needs them in order to do many of the functions that we associate with being alive. Now, again, having too much of them is not a good thing. Having too little of them is not a good thing. You just need to have the right amount. And we'll see what happens when you have too much of them. What kind of diseases do you have? So why are the biomolecules of life important? Well, because human diseases are caused by not having the proper shape, by having too much of them or too little of them. This is why, like in life, just like anything, right, you need to have a balance. If you eat too much, right, that leads to you gaining weight, and it's not necessarily a good thing, right? If you don't take enough food, what happens? That leads to malnutrition, and definitely that's not a good thing. Again, you just need to have the right amount, and it's the same thing when it comes to the biomolecules of life. You just need to have a balance. You just need to have the right amount. Alright, so let's talk about some of the diseases that are caused by having too much of these biomolecules of life. So if you have too much carbohydrates in your diet, too much glucose, right, that leads to diabetes. If you have too much lipids or fats in your diet, that leads to stroke. And in the case of Alzheimer's disease, it's caused by a protein that doesn't have the proper shape. And because this protein doesn't have the proper shape, it cannot do its function. And then if there's a mutation in the DNA, and it's very important for us to talk about this, every single mutation happens at the DNA level. So DNA has instructions on how to make a protein. And essentially, if there's a mutation, we're going to be creating a protein that doesn't have the proper shape. And because it doesn't have the proper shape, it cannot do its function, and that leads to diseases. An example of this is basically cystic fibrosis. So let's talk more about the macromolecules of life. One important feature is that they basically are composed of monomers. When we're talking about monomer, it's basically one chemical subunit. Like say, for example, one glucose, one amino acid, one nucleotide. Now, if you have a bunch of these monomers that are bonded together, then it becomes what we call a polymer. So a polymer is just basically a bunch of monomers that are bonded together by chemical bonds. So for example, a bunch of glucoses, a bunch of amino acids. So let's talk more about what is the function of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates is the primary source of energy. And here we're talking about sugars and their derivatives. Sugars such as, for example, glucose, lactose, starch. Now, when you look at starch, it's basically a polymer. And if you guys remember, a polymer is composed of many monomers. So here you have starch that is composed of many glucoses that are bonded together. Another example is cellulose. And another example is basically glycogen. Again, polymers are made out of a bunch of monomers that are bonded together. So let's take a look at the function of lipids and fats. So lipids and fats are greasy, they do not dissolve in water, and one of their main roles is a long-term energy storage. Now, this is why whenever you gain those extra pounds, it's very difficult to get rid of them because, again, the function is a long-term energy storage. So you need to really work at it in order to get rid of that extra fat. They also regulate growth and development, and in this case, we're talking about, for example, hormones and cholesterol. And they also make the cell membrane. Specifically, the fat that makes the cell membrane is called a phospholipid. And we'll talk more about the cell membrane. We'll spend almost a chapter just talking about phospholipids because they're extremely important.